Hi. This is Nymphs. A compact polyphonic 6-voice analog synth from Dreadbox that might also be the most interesting monophonic or duophonic synth I've seen recently. Despite its size and the fact that it may seem to have relatively few controls, it still packs a few original ideas and extensive modulation and expression-based controls. In this video, I'll take a look at how to use it, a few tips and ideas leveraging its unique features, and pros and cons compared to other synths on the market. Before I start, a quick disclosure: Dreadbox sent Nymphs over for review, but as always, they have no say over the content of this video. This channel is funded by viewers who subscribe to my content and book updates on Patreon, YouTube Premium and ads, and price check affiliate links in the description, which help the channel regardless of the product you choose to buy. Let's start with an overview. Nymphs is a digitally controlled analog synth, meaning that its oscillators and filter are analog, but their frequency, parameter, and modulation control is all digital, which means you can store and recall presets. Each voice has an oscillator, a sub-oscillator, noise generator, and a 24 dB per octave low-pass filter, along with 2 envelopes, one for the filter and pitch, and another for the VCA, one LFO that applies to each of the voices separately, and LFO2, another global LFO that can apply to multiple parameters. There's also a 6 dB per octave high-pass filter, which is global as well, and a global digital reverb effect, a monophonic one that's applied to all the audio going through the synth. Nymphs can store 49 presets in 7 banks of 7 presets, banks A through G, and it also comes with 49 factory presets. The connectivity story is also pretty simple. You power it via USB, and it also sends and receives MIDI over USB. It comes with a USB cable, but not a power supply. It has a TRS-A type 3.5mm MIDI input and comes with a 5-pin MIDI DIN adapter. Aside from that, it has a headphone output and a single 1/4-inch audio output because the synth's output is monophonic, not stereophonic. Before we dive in and take a listen to its oscillators, filters, reverb, and so on, a word about the interface. The default function of the sliders is written on the bottom, and a shift function, which you access by either holding shift or double tapping shift, will let you edit the parameters that are named on top in inverse text. Some sliders have a third shift function, for example, these for the reverb and these for LFO2. You access these by using the menu, press this button, and then move the rotary switch to either 2 to control the LFO2 parameters or 3 to control the reverb parameters. While we're on the topic of the menu, items 4 through 6 let you control the modulation for the mod wheel, velocity, and aftertouch. And then these 2 options, the mode and MIDI channel selection, have a secondary submenu. You enter them by first choosing the item, so let's say going into mode, and then pressing again to choose the play mode or unison mode. So say, for example, if I wanted to pick unison A, which is 6-voice unison, I'd press here, choose menu item 1, play mode, then press again, and then choose, in this case, item number 2, which is unison A, and I will have picked the first of 4 unison modes. The synth also comes with this handy card, which goes through everything that's available on the menu. Some items are hidden. So, for example, I talked about play mode before, right? You choose a unison mode and then exit, but then there are additional parameters which you can only access using shift and menu, the submenu. Luckily, this is precisely synth-sized, so you'd probably want to keep this under the synth for reference in case you do want to change some of these settings. Now, I won't pretend all of these options are easy. It's kind of like navigating in Boston. You're bound to get lost first time you try. I actually locked myself out of the synth by changing the MIDI channel to 7 instead of changing the chords. You get used to it after a while. Okay, that's the synth. Overall, let's dive in a little deeper, and rather than start with the oscillators and filter, which we'll get to, I promise, I'll flip my typical review order around and talk about a few other things that make Nymphs special. The first is its chord feature, and in particular, the fact that chord types are a modulatable destination. Let's break that down. A prerequisite for the chord feature to work is that you need to be in one of the unison modes. So let's talk about unison modes just for a bit. Poly or polyphonic mode is simple. You have 6 voices. each key plays one voice. Unison A is all 6 voices centered around one key. You can, by the way, change the detune of these voices or move them into a super saw. Right, I'm controlling detune because shift is on. Anyway, back to unison modes. Again, hit the menu, go to 1, hit again to go to submenu. Poly, unison 6, unison 4, 4 voices. If 6 is too much for you, then there's tri and duo. Tri cuts down polyphony to 3, but gives you 2 voices per key, and duo gives you 3 voices per key. Mono is just 1 key at a time with 1 voice. Anyway, let's go back to 6th unison A, and just so we can hear each voice separately, I'm going to turn down the oscillator and turn up resonance, so the filter will self-oscillate. You can play the filter when it self-oscillates, and this just gives us a clean sine wave, so we can tell the different notes apart. Anyway, what the chord mode does, if we double tap this and access the chords, is simply split up the different voices into different notes, up to 7 different chords. And you can store up to 7 different chords per preset. Programming your own custom chords, or intervals I should say, is relatively easy, but it is one more step of menu diving. So you press menu and choose play mode, and then enter the menu. Go into item number 7, which is chord selection. Then hit this again, and you have access to the chords, and then to program them, you just play the chord you want. So let's say play this for number 1, and then maybe this for 2, and then this for 3, and so on, up to 6 notes. Let's maybe go with and yeah, any interval you like, any number of notes. Let's go for that, and yeah, just as simple as that. And then you use this again for chord selection. The bottom slot here, by the way, is no chord, and then these chords transpose as you play, and you get up to 6 voices if you're in unison A. If you choose the one of the fewer unison modes, then you'll get fewer notes, obviously, per key that you press. Now, to kick all this up a notch, like I mentioned earlier, the chord selection is a modulatable destination, just like any slider here. So we may as well talk about the next noteworthy feature I wanted to mention about NYMPHES, and that's the way that it treats modulation, and in particular expression. Now, when it comes to all synths, but in particular ones with a small form factor, there's only so much functionality and sound design capabilities that you can expose on the panel. And I think part of what makes NYMPHES special is the fact that of the relatively limited on-panel features, so much attention is given to expression control of pretty much every synth parameter using mod wheel velocity and aftertouch. The way you assign these is, again, relatively easy once you get used to the menus. You enter the menu, then choose the source you want to assign. Let's go for, say, 6 for aftertouch, and then just move the slider that represents the parameter you want to edit. In this case, if I want to change the chord, I need to enter shift mode, double tap, because chord is a shift function, and then move the slider up to signify mod depth. So now aftertouch will change chords based on the mod depth. So the more chords I'd like to swap with an aftertouch motion, the deeper I'd need to set the mod depth. And mod depth ties in with the start position. So here I'll start with the first note and start cycling through the chords. But if I exit this menu, then set the start point, say, to here, I'll start with a chord and modulate whatever's left from there. And with a slightly less random choice of chords, you could do something like this with aftertouch, or modulate chords with an LFO to get a more even transition. Now you can modulate multiple parameters at a time. So let's say if I bring back my oscillators, I could say assign the mod wheel, right? So number 4 to, because it's already doing vibrato in this preset, but say to increase the sub oscillator and maybe noise a bit, and any other regular or shift parameter, but not the reverb parameters or the LFO2 parameters. And one more note about this, at least as of the current firmware, you can't set a negative mod depth. So say if I wanted increasing pressure to reduce the level of the sub oscillator, you can't do that currently. And I know I'm going to get asked this because of the emphasis on expression here. Currently, NYMPHES doesn't support polyphonic aftertouch or MPE. Hopefully that will be added in a future firmware update based on the emphasis on expression here. So while we're on the topic of modulation, let's move on to the LFOs. NYMPHES has 2 LFOs. Like I mentioned earlier, LFO1 is polyphonic per voice, LFO2 is global. Each LFO has 4 on-panel controls and a few secret or hidden controls in the menus. The on-panel controls are pretty obvious, so let's say go for LFO1 and modulate the cutoff. LFO1, set a rate, choose depth, shift, right, to the filter. So now LFO1 is connected to the filter, and let's choose its rate. And there are the usual suspect shapes. The LFO shape slider is continuous, but the shapes don't morph, they just swap from one to the next. Anyway, so that's rate and wave, and then the other 2 controls are a delay. So the LFO fades in and fade out. The LFO fades out, and with a fade set to maximum, the LFO cycles only once at each of the shapes. 1 cycle up, 1 cycle up and down, 1 cycle down. It's particularly important to know this about LFO2 because LFO2 is a source in this mod matrix, whereas the envelopes aren't. So to summarize the modulation status here, the bottom ADSR envelope goes to either the filter or oscillator pitch. The top envelope, the shift envelope, goes only to the VCA. LFO1 goes only to the filter and to pitch, but is polyphonic. And LFO2 goes pretty much anywhere you want. So just to take a look at how this assignment works, we obviously want pulse width modulation on this square wave. So we go into the menu, choose LFO2. Now we're making assignments. We need to assign the modulation of pulse width. That's a shift parameter. So double tap to assign pulse width depth, and then just increase the depth. And we have pulse width modulation using LFO2. So those are basic LFO and envelope features. The LFOs have additional parameters that are unfortunately not accessible directly on the panel. So that's where this help card comes in. You can change the LFO rate from tempo synced to low to high to tracking the keyboard, and you can choose to either sync the LFOs to key presses or not. Now, I'll be honest, I still don't remember how to do this by heart, so you just need to keep this nearby. So let's say that I wanted, for example, to increase LFO1's rates to higher rates than the default. So this is about as fast as it goes in the low LFO rate. So if I wanted some audio rate goodness, I'd need to enter the menu, choose LFO2, which is the gateway to the LFO's submenu, and then shift menu is how you access this. And then this slider now has the function of selecting one of 4 LFO tracking or speed modes. While we're here, this slider turns key sync on and off. Let's turn it on. And then if shift is on or off, you're editing this for either LFO1 or LFO2. So that just is what it is. Anyway, having saved that, I can now edit the rate and explore the high range, a bit of audio rate FM. The LFO is digital. I think it goes up to 1 kilohertz or 2 kilohertz. Having turned keysync on for LFO1 means, because it's polyphonic, that it will re-trigger per key press, per voice. You can get these kind of arpeggiated patterns with keysync on. So having covered all that, let's turn LFO mod depth down. Let's talk about the core oscillators and filter of nymphs. The structure per voice is relatively simple. There's a main oscillator and a sub-oscillator, square wave. The main oscillator can be either saw, square, with PWM if you want, or triangle. And shapes do morph here. That's a nice way to get interesting tones if you modulate the wave parameter, which is a modulatable destination. I already mentioned square sub-oscillator, noise generator, all modulatable destinations. We talked about pulse width, detune, chords, and there's also a glide parameter. And then the filter is a 24 dB per octave low-pass filter, and it does what you'd expect. Low-pass filter with resonance that does decrease the level of filtered audio significantly. And yeah, sounds nice and good as you'd expect. And it does self-oscillate, and let's lower the oscillators, and it does track as you play the keyboard. If you turn up filter tracking all the way up, yeah, and it gives a really nice sine wave tone. The envelopes are what you'd expect. An envelope for the filter. And it can be snappy if you like. So that's the filter envelope, ADSR, and BCA envelope. The usual envelope stuff. Let's reduce release and move on to the reverb. The reverb has 4 parameters controlled using these sliders as well. Let's go into the menu, choose item number 3 for reverb, bring it into the mix, and then you've got size and decay. You can go pretty long, you can filter out the reverb, low pass filter. And the reverb will actually self-oscillate if you just leave it like that. At the longest decay, size changes its character. And yeah, it's a really nice, just a shame that it isn't stereophonic, but does work and adds a nice character to the sound. Reverb parameters, like chord parameters, by the way, are stored within the preset. And one neat feature, when you swap presets, right, so hit load and let's say go into bank 2 here. That's my intro preset. So when you swap presets, even though the sound changes immediately, the reverb doesn't die out, which is cool. Okay, before I head out to the pros and cons, just a few tips and ideas that I picked up as I was looking at this synth that might be helpful to you. First tip, I would highly recommend getting a MIDI controller that can send out MIDI CCs. You're going to want an arpeggiator and sequencer, of course, because it doesn't have those either. But try as I may to remember whether I'm in shift mode or not, I always end up editing the wrong parameters at one point or other. For example, I mapped this knob to control the chord parameter, so I no longer have to reach for shift to change that here. That applies also to all these shift enter submenu items, so you can change all these parameters with MIDI CCs. Plus, there are parameters that you can't even access on the panel. For example, you can have LFO2 modulate LFO1's rate. You'll need to use MIDI CC 77 for that to change the mod depth, but you can actually do that, and that's not something you can access on the panel. Another little tip, glide, not only is it polyphonic, like I mentioned earlier, but it also applies to chord transitions. Which is pretty cool, I think. Next tip, pressing load doesn't actually load the preset. It just previews it. So if you change parameters and then hit load again, which is the actual load function, you'll lose all your changes. Then don't forget, each slot really is 2 slots, your user presets and a factory preset. So let's load, say this. Right, that's my preset, but a long press here will load up whatever factory preset was in this slot. And then final tip, if you're jealous of synths with more than one oscillator per voice, these Unison modes, Duo and Tri, will give you 2 or 3 voices per key, obviously at the expense of a combined voice count. And then you can use the chord mode to set different intervals for those keys, even subharmonic intervals. So for example, I'll go into the menu, choose 1, press again, choose 7 to edit the chords, then hit this again. So intervals can go up but also down. Let's say that I want to set a 5th interval for slot 7 and 4th for 6, and then let's do major 3rd, minor 3rd, but also go to subharmonics. And yeah, let's go for sub-oscillator while we're at it. So for example, in Duo mode, we have a 3-voice polyphonic synth with 2 oscillators, 2 sub-oscillators per voice at an interval of our choice. Let's use this knob. And you can also bunch up 3 voices like this and modulate the chords, turning this into quite a unique both monophonic and polyphonic synth. Okay, so let's talk about the pros and cons for nymphs, and I'll start with the cons. If you compare this to similarly priced digital synths, you'll probably get more features with digital synths. For example, the new boutiques from Roland now have more than 4-voice polyphony, or say a Waldorf Blofeld, and I'm sure many others, so you are paying a premium here for the fact that this is an analog synth. So setting that aside, assuming this has the features you want at the price that's right for you, I'll split my other cons to thoughts on the hardware side, things that won't change, and things on the firmware side, wish list features that might be added. On the hardware side, this menu system takes getting used to, and I still make mistakes every now and then. Aside from that, this synth only has 6 voices, which may be limiting depending on what you play, and unfortunately, it's not in stereo, which certainly would have been nice for the reverb. Passing this through a stereo chorus or stereo reverb sounds delicious, so I do recommend doing that. Finally, on the hardware side, there's no way to see the value of parameters as you change presets or mod depths. So if you find that there's too much going on, there's no way to see what you're modulating. Just go into one of the sources that you think is doing something it's not supposed to and long press the menu to erase all mods. Then there are a few things on the firmware side that I wish they'd change. Since I don't use this two-handed with a shift, certainly it would be nice not to need to double tap to enter shift mode, just tap once to enter shift. Then another thing, as the sliders rarely represent the true value of a parameter as you're changing shift modes, currently there are 2 catch-up modes for these sliders, either jump, which means it immediately changes the value, or catch, which means you have to look for it. A relative or scaled mode would be nice so that when you touch a fader, values don't jump instantaneously and you don't need to search for the value with the fader. One thing I hope they'll add soon is the ability to back up and share presets. Currently, there's no way to do that. Also, a software editor would be nice since there are so many modulation destinations here. Hopefully Dreadbox or an enterprising third party will come up with that soon because the MIDI implementation supports it. Finally, it would be nice if they add a way to modulate reverb parameters and to set a negative mod depth for the mod sources, not just a positive mod depth. On the pros side, first regarding sound, despite being a relatively simple synth, and this is a matter of personal taste, I think nymphs oozes character, the oscillators have a strong presence, and the filter does the analog job it's supposed to when you start cranking it up, and when you crank up resonance all the way and turn off the oscillators, it can play these gentle sine waves, which I think sound great. Also, the reverb, while not in stereo, does have an interesting and gritty character that complements this sound very nicely. Now, all that's great, but where I think NYMPHES is truly unique is how it acts as a mono or duo or tri-synth, especially when using the chord function. Yes, it can create massive unison saws, but when you start setting up and modulating custom voice intervals, that's where I think this synth truly shines and is unique. Finally, I love the focus on expression on the panel, the fact that this synth invites you to modulate everything with your fingers as opposed to a fixed envelope or LFO. Hopefully, MPE and polyphonic aftertouch will be added in future firmware updates. So that's it for NYMPHES. If you liked the insights in this video, there are plenty more in my ever-expanding book, available to the good people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful, ring the bell below if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.